women were kind of a victim in the creation of birth control by these two guys. And the goal was absolutely control for overpopulation.
Yep.
You know?
And a lot of times women are victims in the abortion industry too. There are so many women victims who get swept under the rug, whether they be a sexual assault victim. There have been several cases that Planned Parenthood has come under like heavy fire for, because there have been abusers, like pedophiles, who take their victims to get abortions and they haven't reported it. Or there have been women who have died from getting abortions and they haven't reported it. It's not a pro-woman industry, even if they portray it like that, even if they portray it as a feminist ideal. I think you can be a feminist without supporting that.
All right, everybody. Welcome back to the Re-Education Camps. This is the Undoctrination Podcast. I'm your host, Maggie.
And I'm Olivia.
And this week, we are talking about the totally non-controversial subjects of feminism and the manosphere.
Oh, lovely.
So this episode came about because Andrew Tate has been all over the news. And last week, I released a short on YouTube talking about how his censorship online led to more and more people going to watch his videos and adopt his ideas. And Olivia, I don't know if you've seen the comments on it. They are just filled with people who are like, W Tate, like,
I don't know if they're 12 or what, because it's a lot of anonymous profile pictures, to be honest.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of people on my timeline, too, who have been, calling for him to be let out of jail for one, because him and his brother Tristan are in, like, Romanian jail until February. I think.
Why are they in jail?
Their stay keeps getting extended. They haven't been formally charged with anything, but, I mean, the implication is that they're being accused of sex trafficking or human trafficking. Whatever that is. And I don't know if I don't believe that's been proven or disproven yet, so I'm not going to speak necessarily on that. But I think there's a lot of valid things to criticize him for, and just because he's been censored doesn't mean we should be like, oh yeah, everything he says is right. I'm saying, he should have the right to say it, but he's back on social media. Like, somebody is tweeting for him from jail, so
he's like, I'm in the Romanian dungeon, tweeting from a pit of snakes. I will win. I will conquer all. Yeah.
And also he's a recent convert to Islam, I believe. And he has been talking about how basically the West and feminism has, ruined women, and Islam and Eastern religions and traditions like that are better for women. And I do take issue with that. I'm not generalizing Muslims or the religion of Islam, but if you look at theocracies, which is kind of the thing that he advocates for, like a society based around that value, I do think that's bad for women. And, we should talk about it and call it out, but have him in the media. We can have him in the media so we could debate about it and call it out. But I don't know if he actually takes debates with people who know what they're talking about, because I actually have seen a lot of clips of him, just handing L's down to like random like little podcasters and stuff who just are like, oh, you're sexist, without actually providing evidence. So like, let's dig into that.
Right, absolutely. I think this idea that feminism is so toxic is actually based off of a modern conception of feminism. And really, the point of this episode is we really wanted to get into the rich history of feminism, how, socialist type feminists took over the movement and made it what it is today, and why we're seeing so many problems between men and women. And also, I think we both wanted to kind of get into the idea that men and women are in this constant battle against each other, because that's actually a very, socialist feminist idea that women and men are two strong groups that are always going to be pitted against each other.
It's by design, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So I kind of wanted to start off by taking us super way back in the day to London in 1759. Now, it's hard for a lot of us to conceive of how, women were subjugated back in the day, because we are really afforded, I honestly, at this point, all of the rights that men are. And we have pretty much achieved political equality. But back in the day, women really didn't have much agency. It was very hard for them to work, get into, lines of business that they wanted to. They really didn't have much financial independence. They couldn't vote. And so we kind of start the story off with this woman named Mary Wollstonecraft. Or Wollstonecraft.
That is such a mouthful, but I know who you're talking about. And actually,
it's a total mouthful.
Let me preface, because I want to say that for the listener, you don't have to be a feminist to listen to this. I actually don't personally and never have considered myself to be a feminist, but I'm more familiar and more friendly to feminist ideas now because of studying the history and realizing that it's not just like first, second, third wave. There's always been many schools of thought within feminism. There's always been, socialist feminism, individualist feminism. And so, what we're this lady who we're going to talk about is more of an individualist.
She was. And another thing to consider at the time is there had not been a mass feminist movement at the time. That was to come later. And she was kind of the foremother of the first wave of feminism. And she was actually very libertarian. She was of the classical liberal tradition. She grew up in a very poor family. Her dad was a handkerchief weaver, then turned into a farmer, and he really didn't do well in that either. They moved a trillion times, were constantly losing money, and her dad was an abusive drunk and would frequently try to beat up on Mary's mom, Elizabeth, and oftentimes Mary had to get into the way of these fights and protect her mother. And so you see a woman who is already set up in this scenario where she is having to be stronger than a lot of women were expected to be. And when her mother died, Mary, not Mary's brother, was expected to financially take care of the family. But I mean, we're talking about the 1700s in England. And so that was very difficult for her. And she didn't really have a formal education. She got a lot of her education by visiting a friend's library and just doing a lot of self-study, which I can relate to. I love reading.
I know, you're like been talking about the self-study thing recently. I'm kind of on that too.
Miss Mary was doing it way before all of us were. And that's how she became so well educated. But by the time she was 28, she wasn't married, had no prospects, was basically homeless. She had a lot of failed business ventures, and she was approached. Yeah, girl boss.
She was girl bossing too hard.
All of my businesses have failed. So she's approached by a friend and is asked to write a pamphlet about education and women's access to education. And this is really how she got her start, just by advocating for equal access to education for women. And she was also living during the same time as the French Revolution was starting to kick up. And so there was a lot of more libertarian societies forming and talking to each other. She knew Thomas Paine. She knew Edmund Burke. She actually wrote a rebuttal to Edmund Burke called A Vindication of the Rights of Man. So she was an OG classical liberal queen. And for those that don't know what a classical liberal is, that means she was just advocating for human rights and self-ownership.
Yeah, don't confuse it with the liberals of today.
Yeah, she was advocating for freedom from government tyranny. And she quickly realized that in this society of men who were also doing this, a lot of times women were not really included in the conversation. And so she shifted her focus towards advocating for a libertarian type of feminism and wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women. And in this book, she has this amazing quote that I wanted to read to you. So she says, "Though I consider that women in the common walks of life are called to fulfill the duties of wives and mothers by religion and reason, I cannot help lamenting that women of a superior caste have not a road open by which they can pursue a more extensive plan of usefulness and independence."
Hold on.
How many women How many women thus waste life away, the prey of discontent, who might have practiced as physicians, regulated a farm, managed a shop, and stood erect, supported by their own industry, instead of hanging their heads surcharged with the dew of sensibility? And I mean, go off, first of all.
Go
But
off, but also, did she say the word superior? That kind of like confused me a little bit.
well, what she's saying is, yeah. So, I mean, like she's saying that women that have superior intellect or are more called to these traditionally masculine roles should be able to go and do that.
I'm not going to
Now,
cancel her. I'm not going to say she's problematic.
yeah.
That's presentism. However, I will say, I mean, I'm sure that's a product of the time because women were
Mhm.
viewed as dumb and
Yeah,
subservient, and so if they are
absolutely.
superior, maybe they could go on and get a higher education.
Right,
Now,
right.
I feel like it's I do talk to feminists who are more like traditional in the sense that they want
Mhm.
to be a stay-at-home wife or want to be a
Yeah,
stay-at-home mom, and they're like, yo, this is feminist too. Like, that doesn't mean you're
yeah.
better than me if you want to be a girl boss. You can be a girl boss, but I want to be
Mhm.
like, a homemaker. And I don't think
Yeah.
that I just want to point that out.
Mhm.
I don't want people to think that that makes you like inferior if you do choose that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And like we can get into this later, but like this is something I've struggled with a lot because I've always felt really called to be a wife and a mom
Mhm.
eventually. Um, and so this is something I've struggled with. Um, but I think where she's coming from in this day and age is that there was not a choice, you know? And so there was no freedom to choose to be called to motherhood and being a wife because that was all that was offered to you,
Right.
right? Um, she, probably ruffled a few feathers with this in her time. Obviously, a huge advocate for women being able to get educated. Um, but she had a lot of interesting romantic dalliances
I
and a
did read
lot
a
of
little bit about
heartbreak.
that.
Yeah, yeah. She, man, yeah. She suffered a lot of heartbreak. Like I said before, when she published her first pamphlet, she was 28 and had no
She
prospects.
kind of flopped a little bit, right?
Yeah, in her flop era. And
I honestly relate,
but
like, reading her little
yeah,
biography about how she
I'm
was, like,
like,
so
oh,
depressed over every single
yeah,
breakup. I was like, "Girl."
like relatable, relatable. But she like kind of went on this eat, pray, love style trip. And like genuinely after a breakup, she went on this like eat, pray, love style trip in the 1700s to like Denmark and wrote this fantastic piece of literature, which caught the attention of William Godwin, who at the time had become famous in England because he was writing in the defense of this thing called the corresponding societies, who, were talking about pretty revolutionary ideas. And the British government, tyrannical as ever, as it still is, was on this like campaign to try to shut them down, throw them in prison, make their lives impossible. And so William Godwin became famous for arguing that they weren't doing anything wrong. They weren't committing any violence. And so the British government should leave them alone. So another libertarian king advocating for
I
freedom,
love him.
he and Mary ended up like going from friends to being in love to getting married. And Mary ends up having a baby. But obviously, as was relatively common at that time, she suffered some pretty severe complications during childbirth and ended up passing away. But
Who that
the
baby
baby,
go on to be?
the baby ended up being Mary Shelley, who went on to write Frankenstein and be one of the most famous women in
That
literature
fact blew
history,
my mind. I was like,
right?
"What?" And I was like, "Oh my god."
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. But Mary Wollstonecraft is important because she really inspired the first feminists. Like she was the person they were reading. And Mary was very individualist, right? She was not arguing that the government should give special favors to women. All she wanted was political
Oh,
equality,
yeah,
meaning,
she was speaking out
yeah.
against the House of Lords. The fact that it was, like,
Mhm.
1% of the rich British aristocrats, the landowners,
Mhm.
that were controlling everybody. She didn't like that, male or
Mhm.
female. I mean, there was a lot
Yeah.
of stuff she advocated for that helped men a lot too.
Yeah, and she was raging against taxes as well, which girl
Based.
boss, very based. But she was really a major building block in the first wave of feminism, which came probably a century later. Um,
Which is
and
crazy to put in perspective. Sorry to cut you off,
yeah.
but that's crazy to put in perspective because when you think about the first feminists, I really didn't know, like, when I did some research, I kind of assumed
Mhm.
that the first wave started, like, before the 20th century. I thought maybe, like, the 1800s, or 1700s, 1800s, but no, I really thought it started earlier. So to hear that there was all these individual
Yeah.
feminists in, the 150 years
Mhm.
prior to the first wave of feminism, in the West and
Right.
America starting, that kind of blew my mind because it really proved that it's not all just one conglomerate. It's not all just
Mhm.
one group. There's so many pieces and so many people in history that
Right.
went into that wave.
Absolutely. Well, I think why you see all of this movements building around this time is because there is a hunger for freedom. I mean, the ideas of self-ownership and freedom from government tyranny and the ability to make choices about your life, those are really starting to become popular all around the same time as the American Revolution, the French Revolution, which is when Mary was coming about. And then the first wave of feminism happened because all of these women, these Quaker women who were advocating for
They're
abolitionism,
abolitionists. Yeah.
yeah, they were abolitionists. They were not feminists first. These women were Quaker abolitionists because of their religion. They believed they needed to be involved at this level, but a lot of them, through advocating for, people who were enslaved to become free and retain some individual rights that were granted to other people in the country, women looked around and they were like, "Oh my gosh,
Yeah, maybe
wait,
we
we
should get
don't
on that
have
too.
equality. We
One
don't have freedom."
one historical fact that blows my mind is that freedmen, like black males, could vote before white women could.
Yes. That
That to
was
me is
actually
insane.
that was a major point of conflict in the early feminist movement. And one point I want to make in going through the history is that there's always been a diversity of thought and a lot of kind of warring groups within the feminist movement. And for the early feminists, the first wave, which really started mid 19th century. So like the 1840 was like the jumping off point. Um, they tended to disagree about tactics, like what exactly, they needed to do to get some, political equality. Because at that point, they didn't have it. Like they didn't really have much at all. Um, so the first feminist movement started actually at the World Anti-Slavery Convention, which took place in London in 1840. And you might recognize these names. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott are in attendance at the World Anti-Slavery Conference. And in the first few days of the conference, everyone's arguing about whether or not to let women participate. And then they decide, you know what? We're going to like put them in this balcony that's curtained off where they can listen to what's happening, but they don't get to speak or have an opinion, which is so interesting for what was supposed to be a freedom conference,
Isn't it
right?
so
They're like,
crazy how disconnected that was? Because now
yeah,
it makes total sense to,
mhm,
have freedom for everybody altogether, small government applying
yeah,
to everybody, but back then it was just not like that, I guess.
yeah, yeah. And that experience for those feminists, that is really when they're like, oh gosh, like we in fighting for the rights of slaves to become free, like we have realized that we are also not fully free. And so in 1848, they start to plan there. And by 1848, they hold the world's first women's rights convention at Seneca Falls. And here, over the span of 2 days, women and men are coming together and they're figuring out what are the top issues for women right now. And they release the Declaration of Sentiments, which covers legal equality, marriage laws, women in the workplace, and especially voting rights, which were contentious. And now keep in mind, at this point, this is all very much in line with individualist theory. What they're really trying to do at this point is remove the shackles that the government has placed on women so that they can be free to choose whatever path they see fit, right? And over the next several decades, Elizabeth Cady Stanton gets joined by different famous women. Susan B. Anthony is one of them. Sojourner Truth is one of them. Countless organizations get formed, dissolved, all of this stuff happens. And finally, in 1919, the 19th Amendment was ratified, which gave us the right to vote. And that was under President Woodrow Wilson. 1919 and the 19th Amendment. That's pretty easy to remember.
Don't you just love how anytime there's a woman posting their L on Twitter, there's just like repeal the 19th, repeal the 19th.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Yeah.
Love that.
Yeah. I mean, and that's a great point. Like, us having legal equality has nothing to do with like societal issues that are happening right now. That's going to come further down the line. At that point, there was a free love movement forming, but it wasn't really about like hedonism, if that makes sense. It wasn't really about sexual liberation.
Later on, then like the creation of the American Birth Control League. And for people who don't know, that organization later became Planned Parenthood. The American Birth Control League was, founded by Margaret Sanger, had board members who were Nazis and Ku Klux Klan members. Like, this is legit stuff. And, their plan, while at the time they did not advocate for abortion, was contraception access. So basically undesirables could have relations and not produce undesirable children. And then that sentiment later grew into the abortion fight and, the right to, terminate your pregnancy. But it was all started with, eugenicist racism in mind, but it became a feminist issue.
Yeah. And there's a lot of criticisms of early feminist movements that they were not, inclusive.
Y'all weren't all about human rights. Some of y'all were just for yourself.
Such as life. But I think the first wave of feminism is where most women are like, okay, I'm here for this. Like, yes, I would like voting rights. I would like to have a say in the society that is making laws that affect me, right? That is basic human freedom.
I want to see if there is statistics on actually how many women were in support of the suffragettes in the first wave of feminism, because I know that there were many who were not in support, who were like, I don't want male responsibilities either. So they were worried about like paying taxes, being drafted, being the breadwinner. Like a lot of women who didn't want that life, who wanted to stay in the homemaker life were like, oh my God, are they going to force me to be outside the home? There's different sides going on.
Absolutely. And, I want to talk about this lady, Wendy McElroy, who's a pretty famous feminist in the individualist spheres. And she makes a differentiation that's going to be important when we're talking about second wave feminism, because this is when everyone says, oh, this is where everything started to go a little off the rails. Second wave feminism was where you started to see a real splitting in ideology, because voting rights had been secured. Some basic rights had already been secured. But now women were analyzing the patriarchy.
Let's get into some social responsibilities here, ladies.
Yeah, we're getting into the controversial stuff. But there were a million trillion movements within the feminist second wave. But one way I think we should really look at it would be the individualist feminists and socialist feminists. right? So individualist feminists may have many, many views about like different views about women in society or how men and women should interact with each other. There's a diversity of opinions there. The difference is that individualist feminists don't believe in getting the government involved in reshaping society to this, idealized version that actually goes against human nature. So individualist feminists were always pretty normal, just like wanted political equality, wanted to remove legal barriers to getting jobs and all of that stuff. Then you had the social feminists who sought to control the ends. So if we're talking about things like equality and justice, where an individual feminist would want that in the process, so like they would want just laws and equality under the law. Socialist feminists wanted that in the outcome, which is where you get into terms like equity. So let's make sure that everyone is equal in the outcome. So,
that involves so much that is wrong. That involves theft, honestly. That involves redistribution of wealth.
Yeah.
That involves the breakdown of the nuclear family because, usually the wife and the husband or the mother and the father, they have different but equal, I would say, roles in a marriage or family. But equity means something different. Equity means usually the same outcome. Everybody just gets the same crap, and that's not great. That's bad. And there was Marxist feminists who obviously are part of the socialist feminist camp. There was one book, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. This is by Friedrich Engels. He was a Marxist author and an individual commentator. And he argued that women's liberation, the fact that women were treated less than men, it's not because of biology. It's not because of any natural or traditional gender roles. It's because of the nuclear family. And he wrote about the institution of the nuclear family being oppressive towards women. And I think that's, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that's a little bit on the lines of what you're talking about. Basically, like deconstructing these social roles that a lot of people like and enjoy, and it works for them,
Yeah, well, I mean, within Marxist class theory, there is an oppressive class, and you must dismantle all of these systems of oppression. But, you also start disassembling, like, the way people naturally interact voluntarily.
Right.
And so a lot of this stuff is trying to push an outcome that goes against human nature, right? So you had your anarcho-feminist types, which were like anarcho-socialists, right? Or anarcho-communists. And they really did not like the family unit. Like they saw that as like another system of oppression, aka the patriarchy at work that was trying to oppress and subjugate women. And so to them, women's liberation meant, we have to destroy marriage, which
love that
they
for
kind
them.
of did. They kind of did.
I mean, look at the state of America today. Look at how many marriages end in divorce. Look at how many people don't get married. Look at how many people get married for the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
And that's sad. And just to play a little devil's advocate for them, if they're growing up in a time period where your father is allowed to beat your mother right in front of you, the thumb rule, if the stick's not thicker than your thumb, you can totally just beat them with a rod. Like, rule of thumb. That's where that saying came from, you know? So
I had no idea. Oh my gosh.
A lot of stuff is like weird and like has dark history behind it. But like imagine seeing your dad do that and you're like, oh my God, I never want to get married. I never want to have kids. I never want to be in this situation. So I get where they're coming from. It's probably a lot of trauma that made that decision. But of course, marriage and family can be like beautiful and and the best thing in a lot of people's lives, I would say.
Well, have you ever heard of the feminine mystique? It is the book that is like kind of credited with starting the second wave of feminism, or at least creating this massive social movement. By the way, all of the waves of feminism also followed civil rights movements. So it tends to follow that when, when the world is starting to care more about freedom and equality, that translates to all groups. So this was happening around the same time as the civil rights movement. Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique in 1963. And 1963 came after the baby boom that followed World War II, where you saw like the idealization of the suburban life, right? A lot of women during World War II were sent to male-dominated jobs because a lot of the men were off overseas fighting. And so they got a taste of what it was like to work outside of the home. Not that those jobs were particularly glamorous or fun, but they had a taste of what it was like to be outside of the home. And in the 50s, when everyone came back, women were expected to return to the homes and be the perfect wife and mother and
But they were like,
homemaker.
wait.
Yeah. And, you know, at the time, all of these psychologists and therapists were getting like tons of women coming into their office with inexplicable sadness. Like they couldn't quite describe what they were feeling. And what they were kind of feeling was just empty, you know,
They
like not
wanted to feel
fulfilled.
useful and like they have a
Exactly.
purpose beyond just
Yeah.
birthing children and baking cakes. And while
Right.
that's nice, a lot of people do want
Hmm.
something beyond that.
Yeah. And, you know, at the time, the popular narrative was like, that is the way to find life satisfaction. If you are a woman, the perfect ideal for you is to be the Betty Crocker homemaker. Like you are putting out a full spread on the table for dinner every night. You're making sure your kids are quiet and nice. I mean, have you seen those pamphlets from the
Yes.
50s of
Yes.
like
There was one
how to
that went
be a good
viral.
girl? And yeah.
Listen, there was one account, not gonna name names. There's one
Okay.
particular account that is a constant Andrew Tate lover and defender.
Okay.
And this person, I believe is actually a woman, um,
Maybe I know who you're
posted
talking
a
about.
50s pamphlet, and it was like
Mhm.
all these, things listed to do, how to be a great wife, how to be a perfect wife. And it's basically like when your husband comes home from work, make sure the kids shut up, make sure you shut up, make sure dinner's hot
Yeah.
and ready, and be ready for
Right.
sex when he's done. And I'm like, yo, what? And so I read the comments. And people are like, oh, yeah, they don't make women like this no more. They don't make women like this. I
Like,
wish I was in the
yeah.
50s. I was born in the wrong generation. I'm like, okay, the reason you don't have a wife or girlfriend that's doing that kind of
It's
stuff for you like you
because you
want
haven't.
is not because you were not born in the 50s, dude.
Yeah.
Let's be for real.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, here's the thing. Betty Friedan was like talking about something that was really real, and the feminine mystique, what that meant was the idea that women would find fulfillment solely through this, right? And she argued that this was like pretty stifling, not because it's stifling to be a mom and have kids and be that homemaker and take care of your husband. I mean, that's fulfilling for a lot of women. I would love to have kids and be able to like keep a house and everything. It's the idea that that was all they were allowed. Like
Mhm.
culturally, there was no like, oh, we can go here and here and here. Actually, college rates dropped during this time because it was scary for women. Like they thought that was like a bad thing to go and do.
Right.
And so instead of, maybe doing self-study like our girl Mary from way back in the day, like they thought this is supposed to be making me happy, but like it's not. So something's wrong with me.
And there was
So
all this fear mongering. Like, if you do this,
yeah,
no man will ever marry you. No man will ever want to
exactly.
have kids with you.
Yeah.
You're ruining yourself. And then there's this whole, like, as sexual liberation comes along, there's this whole purity culture thing that immediately follows that. And it's like
Hmm.
really confusing for women. And of course,
Yeah.
I believe there are people who consider themselves feminists who are argue for modesty, more purity, not
Yeah.
necessarily like the shameful purity culture, but like, here's a different form, or here's a different way that we can respect ourselves as
Yeah.
women. And there's different schools of thought that,
Absolutely.
surround around that. But just the shame that a lot of women were going
Hmm.
through at that time,
Right.
I can relate to. It's not as
Hmm.
societal as it was back then, because now I feel like American society in general is very pro women,
Yes.
almost to a fault sometimes, because I think
Hmm.
sometimes women can do no wrong when they clearly can.
Right.
But of course, still, I'm generalizing, there's different waves of thought still today.
But yeah, I mean, back then, it's hard for us to conceive of because it's so opposite in our culture now, right? Like, if you
I can't
want to
imagine
be
it,
a
bro.
housewife, if
Oh
you want
my
to be a
God,
housewife, people think you're lazy. They think you're dumb.
I
They think
have
you have
these
no
thoughts very
ambition.
frequently because,
Yeah.
for context for the listeners, I work from home. I almost never have to go anywhere for work. I also like do a lot of cooking and cleaning for my boyfriend, and I'm like, oh my God, am I a freaking trad wife? But am I like also taking on too much responsibility because I also work, but I also don't work outside the home, and also I keep all my own money, which is really nice.
Right.
But I'm like, there's a huge debate, and I really want people, especially women listening to this, to really know you're not the only one if you're having an internal debate about gender roles. Not that one is right or wrong, but there's definitely a balance to be made, and you don't want to feel like, especially if you're a straight woman, you're like trying to appeal to men. You don't want to feel like you're over masculizing yourself or over feminizing yourself. You want to be the strong, independent woman, but you don't want to feel like you have to be that because no one's going to take care of you or no one's going to love you. But that's what's told to people who sometimes want to work outside the home. Not as much anymore, but that's what we see from people like Tate, you know? And I think he's a little bit hypocritical. We could delve back into that because I actually wanted to kind of connect and do a huge wraparound. But Andrew Tate has benefited from feminism. He has used feminism to make money. He has used feminism for engagement. He has used feminism to make, I mean, like, he has claimed to make, you know, $500,000, $1 million a month. I think like 600,000 or something from just cam girls and producing, you know, pornographic material.
So he's kind of a pimp, right?
Oh yeah. He's a proud, self-admitted pimp, which is just like, I mean,
which is it's one of the many pitfalls of second wave feminism, right? Which advocated for sexual liberation because after this book was released, women were like, yeah, we do need to be able to make a choice about what we're doing with our lives. We should be able to go work a job. We should be able to decide, like, you know, marriage is not for me right now, or that marriage is for me and I want to have a job and I want to have kids. This is where the having it all idea came from. But coupled with that, and this will get stronger and stronger over time as feminism becomes more of a homogenous, single-minded kind of movement, was that, you know, sexual liberation was the thing. Like, that's how we liberate ourselves.
It's not only like necessary for liberation, but you are not a feminist if you don't believe in that. So just like how they say TERF, as in like trans exclusionary radical feminist, I just discovered the use of the word SWERF, and that is sex work exclusionary radical feminist. So if you are a feminist who doesn't approve of prostitution, pimping, pornography, sorry, sorry, you're not pimping. You're not
a feminist.
You're not a feminist. You're not pimping. So
I
don't
mean,
like that.
So that came about during this time. That really got strong in the 90s, and we'll get to that. But also, this is where birth control and abortion access became a really big thing in the second wave. And you kind of talked about it a little bit, but birth control has some pretty rough beginnings.
I think we don't talk about it enough as a society. It's
I mean,
the history of it is shaky, and the current and currently it's a little shaky with all the side effects that women can get. You know.
Yeah, and birth control was seen as a huge win for women, which it was, right? But again, now it's almost as if you can't question if it is actually good for women.
No, canceled.
So it started off by these two Harvard professors who were testing it on lab animals like bunnies. And eventually they're like, okay, we have to test this on some women. So they got psych ward patients in Massachusetts who could not really consent to taking these hormone altering drugs. And then they went to Puerto Rico because it was largely recognized as like this poor, uneducated island that America like had to deal with, I guess, that had liberal laws. So they were going to be able to test all of this birth control. And the eugenics was very popular at this time. And they saw the people in Puerto Rico as undesirable. So actually, a large percentage of women in Puerto Rico were sterilized around this time. And then a lot of women were then tested. They were, being given birth control and forced to do these really insanely invasive procedures. All of this without any real knowledge of what was going on. So, women were kind of a victim in the creation of birth control by these two
Yep.
guys. And the goal was absolutely control for overpopulation.
Yep. And a lot of times women are victims in the abortion industry too. There are so many women victims who get swept under the rug, whether they be a sexual assault victim. There have been several cases that Planned Parenthood has come under like heavy fire for, because there have been abusers, like pedophiles, who take their victims to get abortions and they haven't reported it. Or there have been women who have died from getting abortions and they haven't reported it. It's not a pro-woman industry, even if they portray it like that, even if they portray it as a feminist ideal. I think you can be a feminist without supporting that. And, as we get into more of the history, and as we like actually advance like into 2023, and we have all these crazy problems like, biological males in women's sports, and now we have like a lot of gender confusion and gender ideology. I'm a little bit more motivated to actually start identifying as a feminist now, even in my own head, if I don't like go around saying it, because there's still a lot of negative connotations of people who just think it's kind of one overall, corporate like minded thing. But it seems like nobody's really advocating that much for sex-based women's rights. Not anything extra, not anything extra compared to men, but just like, can we please have like our own bathroom? Like, can we please have our own sports team? Like the feminists of the 50s and 60s and 70s, they really advocated for women's sports, along with, going to work and, a little bit pre-sexual liberation.
And you have experience with women's sports, because you were in wrestling and had to participate in a co-ed wrestling team.
And I have, in hindsight, I have feminism to thank for that, because I was not on a girls' team in high school. I did not wrestle girls scholastically, because I'm from a small state, Maryland. There just wasn't a lot of like support for that. So girls wrestling was not sanctioned. But the feminists of the 20th century, they advocated for Title IX. And what that is it doesn't necessarily create a girls team at every single school for every single sport that's, male. So like you don't see a lot of girls football teams, for example, but it makes them have to provide you with the opportunity or an alternative. So essentially, if a girl can try out and make the football team or make the wrestling team, it's technically co-ed. Like you can and are legally allowed to have that right. So that's essentially what I did. I made the cut. Actually, the first day of practice, I was so like, you guys don't know about Hell Week unless you're a wrestler, but it's not even wrestling the first week. You're running laps, you're running sprints, you're like running up and down the bleachers at school, and everybody's throwing up and everyone's crying. So I remember the first day of practice, I like threw up on like the freaking 8-mile run on the way back to the school. And the team captain turned around and like jogged back to me and was like, "You got this." And I was like, "Am I gonna get cut? Like, I'm not going to make the team?" And he was like, "No, by the end of the week, enough people will quit, so they probably won't have to cut anybody." So I just stuck it out, and enough people quit. And so, like, literally, that Hell Week is so crazy that a lot of wrestling teams, especially in smaller schools, because I went to a smaller school, the tryouts are just like, "Can you survive?" So I survived. Queen. It was crazy.
Of course you survived.
Thank you. But I did undergo some sexism, not necessarily from my team. They're really cool, salt of the earth type people, and I really hate the negative stereotype on like rural, working class white folks, because they're not all bigots. I had a great time at that school. However, when we would go to other schools and other matches, a lot of guys would literally forfeit their match to me because they did not want to embarrass themselves, whether like wrestling a girl, just the nature of it is embarrassing, or like losing to a girl or beating a girl. I got a lot of guys tell me, "Oh, it's a lose-lose situation because nobody wants to lose to a girl."
You, then like,
but if I beat you, I feel like an asshole. But I never looked at it that way. I'm like, I'm a wrestler just like you, And I remember one particular time I was at a tournament, and before it was a tri-meet, so there's 3 teams there, and before the referee calls everybody over, so there's like 100 dudes there. I'm the girl, and he's giving everybody the rules, no fighting, no cussing, no anything like that, because they have to do that because wrestlers are crazy. If they lose a match, they go crazy, low-key. But then he turns to me in front of all the 100 dudes standing around and is like, and this is a man's sport, so you can't cry when you lose. You can't cry when you get hurt. Da 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 da. Don't expect to like have anyone feel bad for you. And I was so stunned. It was like my third or fourth match like ever wrestling, and I was like, oh my god, of course I'm gonna do bad. Like I've never even done this before. Why are you discouraging me? Like he was so mad that a girl dared to try out. Anyways, he got fired. But yeah, my dad don't play that. He called the county. He was like, yo, but
get rid of this man.
Yeah, no, I did face a little bit of sexism. But even at that time, people tried to liken me to modern day feminists. And I did an interview, I think, with the Washington Post back then, because I was winning some matches, and I was like, before I was into politics, I was a little locally famous for wrestling. And so I would get, interviewed by, national and local news. And they would always ask me, like, are you a feminist? Are you doing this because you're a feminist? Da 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 da. And the Washington Post, I kid you not, they asked me, and this is meant to be positive. They weren't trying to insult me, but it sounds like an insult. Do you liken yourself to other people in male-dominated fields like Hillary Clinton? Does she inspire you at all? This is like 2016, so of course, like she's relevant at the time. And I was like, can you cut that out of the interview, please? Like, no. And they were like, oh, okay. I'm sorry, Jeff Bezos. Sorry, the Washington Post. No, I'm not endorsing Hillary Clinton. I'm 16 years old. Like, stop. So they try to make everything a feminist issue.
Yeah.
This is all to say that I consider myself more of an individualist. So I wasn't assigning myself to these political issues that were more than not, left-leaning and left-wing. But in hindsight, I did have feminists to thank because they gave me that Title IX opportunity. I actually had the opportunity to meet somebody who I believe was a tennis player who advocated for that, because now the old feminists are kind of coming back out because of the whole like biological males in women's sports thing. And I had the opportunity to speak at, there's a great group called Icons, and I got to speak at the Icons conference with a bunch of like original, like OG women's athlete feminists who were like before Title IX. Like I was like, oh my God, like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, like that, like those types of people.
Yeah.
And I also, I was there with the swimmers who like got second place to Leah Thomas, like the UPenn transgender swimmer who won the NCAAs last year. And I was like, oh my God, is this the new feminist movement? Is this where we're at now? We have to get males back out of our spaces? Like, what is going on?
Well, there was, when I was doing research for this, I was like, oh my gosh, I can consider myself a feminist now because I'm learning about individualist feminism, which is just a branch of classical liberal.
Oh, your followers are going to hate this episode, Maggie.
I know.
Mine will too.
I can again, because like now I know there are other branches rather than just like what we've seen online recently. I mean, there's something from that second wave called cultural feminism, which is all about, like celebrating the differences between men and women and not trying to force women to become more like men in order to have, equality or to be treated well. And I'm like, yes, this is like my kind of stuff. Like I love women. I love advocating for women. I think it is very hard nowadays to grow up in a society where, well, for one thing, if you're a woman, you're expected to be a feminist. And the kind of feminist you're supposed to be means you're going to be on the left. And so if you're not in line with everything someone is telling you to believe, then you like hate yourself. You're a pick-me.
Internalized misogyny.
Obviously, you're an anti-feminist because there's only two options. You can only be a fourth wave, like radical modern day feminist, or you can be an anti-feminist and hate women.
Pro-choice, pro-sex work.
Yeah.
Pro everything. You cannot be anti-everything, and you have to advocate for literally anything that they say. And now the new thing is like, we hate white feminism. That's the new thing that a lot of fourth wave feminists are
That's what I'm
going
to get accused of. But
get white women out of feminism. I'm like, y'all are eating yourselves at this point, so go ahead and do that. But
And what feminism was always supposed to be about was the liberation of women. And so what that means for different people is, I mean, that means wildly different things for different people.
Yeah.
But at least for me, like, I want girls that are growing up in this day and age to not deal with the mental chaos of like trying to figure out what it means to be a woman in the 21st century. Right? Because almost everything
We're
we
gonna
are
find out
told
together,
is
Maggie.
contradicting.
We're gonna find out together.
Yeah, almost everything we're told is contradicting. And that kind of brings me to more modern day stuff. Like, we grew up in third wave, more like sex focused feminism. And a lot of it was addressing really pertinent issues like, violence against women. Like, that became the big thing. And so a lot of women, including myself, were told from a very young age, like, you are probably going to be R-worded. I don't know if I can say that on YouTube. You're going to be sexually harassed. All of these bad things are going to happen to you. You're going to marry a man and you're going to find out one day that he's an abusive, crazy person, right? And we're just sold all of this fear-based stuff. And I'm going to be honest with you, Olivia. When I got into college, I was like, you know what? I consider myself an anti-feminist because this stuff isn't happening. And then it happened to me. And I was like, you know what? I would have loved it if the feminism I grew up with was teaching me how I can protect myself from things rather than constantly pointing the finger at men and saying, oh, well, men need to change. All men are doing this. Like, that's not helping us. You know, like antisocial freaks are everywhere. Okay. That is just something we're going to have to deal with. And part of being a woman and being a real feminist is acknowledging that, like, we are a little more vulnerable.
We are at risk.
We're built biologically to be a little more vulnerable. And so if we want to advocate for women, how about we teach them how to protect themselves from all of these things
rather than just saying, feminists.
Yeah. Rather than just saying, like, oh, this is going to happen to you one day, and then you're just going to be a victim. Like, that's what we got set up with, you know?
Right. So, like, Frederick Engels, the Marxist feminist writer, would literally say it's not biology. There is no biological reason for women to have a different standing in society. It's men. It's the nuclear family. And it's like, that's just not, it's not based in reality. That's not based in science. That's just not true. And I can relate to that. I kind of wish I was told a little bit more about, I guess, like the dangers of being a woman in society. I feel like I was taught to protect myself, which is great. Like, I'm a lifelong martial artist and I've been shooting guns since I was like 4 years old. Yeah. So there is that.
I was not. There were no guns in my household.
See, I feel like, I do wish my parents kind of instilled in me a little bit of worry just because I'm a woman. Because in college, I would like go to parties and stuff. I would do stuff alone, and I felt like really safe because I'm trained in self-defense. Mm-hmm. But I did do, I did have unsafe practices because I thought I was, invincible almost. But as a woman, nobody is, but as a woman, you're especially not.
Yeah, absolutely. I just remember being a teenager, and we talked about this last episode. I was kind of like really on the left growing up. And then I did like this full 180, and feminism was like my OG starting point along with like gay rights issues. And so when I did my full 180, I was almost like, these statistics are made up. This doesn't happen to as many women as we think. And then I encountered the real world and I was like, oh, but they do. But they do. And
it's like, it's something like 1 in 4 women are like raped or sexually assaulted in their lifetime. It's a huge number.
Part of the problem I have is that we've created this false left-right dichotomy. Like, if you care about women, you're on the left. Mm-hmm. If you care about men, you're on the right. You can't care about both. Mm-mm. Because these are two separate groups that are constantly at war. So you have to pick a side. You have to pick a side. You either care about men or you care about women, and you can't care about both because both hate each other and they're constantly at war and they're constantly trying to oppress each other. And it's like, no,
and
like there's a lot of stuff.
Every time.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of stuff.
They sell the courses, the alpha male courses.
Right. There's a lot of stuff that like I learned growing up that I then rejected, that because I rejected it because it was feminist, that ended up hurting me. I trusted people too much. That gave me red flags, right? So I do think there is a place, especially on the right, for women to start advocating more for women's issues. I don't want to use the government to do it, right? I mean, I do, if someone hurts you, like, you should go to the police. But like, I do think there are a lot of things that have set us up for failure, right? And one of those being hookup culture. And I think we might have like somewhat different opinions on this. I like what you said earlier about like, you know, there's like hookup, sexual liberation culture, and then there's the backlash of like Puritanism, right? I'm just putting that out there. I am religious, right? So I have my own personal beliefs for myself, but I don't think that we need these two completely opposite ends of the spectrum. Like, that is what's the problem,
but that's
right?
the trap we get sucked into with literally every single social issue to ever exist on the face of the planet. There's only these two extreme options. You have to be a like totally sexually liberated woman. You have to have OnlyFans. You have to sell pictures of yourself for $5.99 a month, or you got to be a nun. You got to be totally pure. You know, save yourself for marriage, all that kind of stuff, and you have to judge everybody that doesn't do that. And it's like, first of all, can we not judge either either side? I don't want to judge women who do OnlyFans. I do think it's detrimental. I do think it's bad for mental health and bad for your just your lifelong goals. What if you want to get married or have a family in the future? Will that come up? So I do have concerns about that. But it's like, I do think, and not to take autonomy away from women because they have their own choices, but I do think a lot of women were kind of tricked and coerced into it. Like Andrew Tate, who admitted to going on dates with women, picking them up, he said making them fall in love with me, then taking them
the lover boy tactic.
And saying we're going to be so rich together, and then amasses like dozens of women under him. I think it was like 70 or something, I don't know. But dozens of women under him producing porn for him, and he would make money.
And that is exploitative. Right? When we're talking about exploiting women,
that is exploitation.
That right there,
that is bad.
Is exploitation. And by the way, a lot of women that are doing sex work are being exploited like that. That's how a lot of it happens.
If you would do it, if you were rich, then go ahead. But if you're doing it because you're broke and you need money, girl, you're being exploited.
I forget which individualist libertarian, like feminist, said this, but she argued that, if women, she was like railing against prostitution, but not like, oh, we should make it illegal, but that if women had more opportunity to make money, then they would be doing it less, which I think is a really interesting idea. I do think a lot of young girls look at their college bills, these predatory student loans that they sign, and they're like, well,
guess I'll strip.
I could make all of this money and pay all of this off, and that'll give me financial freedom.
I think men have their own version. A lot of crypto bros and a lot of people get into like pyramid schemes and stuff like that. Like there's a lot of get rich quick schemes for like either gender, and what OnlyFans is being sold as currently is almost like a get rich quick scheme. Everyone has like top 1% or top whatever percent of OnlyFans in their bio, but they are not really honest about the money they're making. They're really selling young girls, 18-year-old girls, this idea that they should be doing this too. It's really, really weird.
Well, what they're selling is the idea that sex has no meaning.
Right.
Right? And that is what I reject, is like this idea that sex has no meaning, especially for women, especially. This is what I mean by like, we should not try to become men.
No,
I think men are more.
We can die in childbirth. We're giving men so much responsibility when we do that.
We take on a massive liability, aka the chance of getting pregnant every time it happens. So I feel like, and this might be pseudoscience, but like I feel like women have developed to attach more emotions to this thing.
Yeah,
and we are told that like, no, like this is liberating.
No, right? It's biology. To survive as a human race, we had to evolve to be choosy with our partner, or else we would have been wiped off the face of the planet by reproducing with not a good specimen. So women are the arbiters of that. We can, unless there's a RAPE situation, we control who we have children with, and we have to be serious about that,
Absolutely. And I do want to make a distinction, because I do get a lot of flack a lot of the time when I talk about this subject. People think that I think women are bad that like to like engage in casual sex and hookup culture, or they think that I don't believe that women have autonomy. There is a difference between, first thing, there's a difference between thinking something is bad for people and that it should be illegal.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of things are bad for people, and I would never advocate for them to become illegal. I think you have your own choices to make, and you can make better choices for yourself than I can. There's also a distinction between thinking that something is bad for someone and then thinking that someone who does that thing is a bad person, which I don't believe. I think just based on my experience, I know that young women are facing a lot as they're growing up right now, a lot of mixed messages that say that, like, even when it comes to our appearance, like there's been a huge conversation happening about how TikTok is promoting extreme plastic surgeries for women that can be life-threatening. I mean, let's talk about BBLs.
Let's talk about the BBL.
That is actually crazy. Very life-threatening.
It has like the highest rate of death in like any major plastic surgery like that. It is really insane, the length, and it's expensive too. The recovery time is horrible and long. It's really crazy the lengths that women will go to be perceived as sexually attractive. And also to circle back and touch on that point you made, a lot of feminists will say, well, like, what if women, I enjoy sex. Like, I'm a woman. Like, I can enjoy sex. What if I'm the one that wants a one-night stand? What if I'm the one that wants the casual hookup? That's
good
fine.
For you. Do it.
I am not saying that women don't have their autonomy. They don't like sex, da-da-da-da-da. I'm saying that culture is not good for you. You can want it all you want, but it's not ideal.
Yeah. I think so. I'm not going to read her entire essay, but any woman that's like out there maybe listening to this who is struggling with this particular subject, I really recommend going and reading Bridget Fettis's I Regret Being a Slut essay. It is probably the most poignant and true thing I've read about what it's like to be a young woman engaging with this culture. She's now 43, I think, and just had her first kid.
Really? She looks great.
I know. I love her so much.
Good. I didn't know she was
I love her so much. Yeah. She's like genuinely a very big role model for me, at least. But Bridget Fettis had a lot of like what she might call mistakes throughout her 20s. And she wrote this whole essay about what that was like, and writes what she would tell her daughter. And she says that sex can be empowering when you're coming from a position of healthy self-esteem. If you're coming from a place of trauma or insecurity, casual sex won't heal that. And then at the end of the essay, she says, I regret being a slut. I regret it because I regret that those men can say they slept with me. Still, that's how I know I finally value myself. Every woman should feel this way. Sleeping with me is a privilege, and you have to be worthy. And I feel like feminist discourse has gotten away from that message of like,
value yourself.
I'm too good for you, and has gotten to let me devalue myself, so that I can...
It's acting masculine. It's not caring about... I mean, like, not that men don't necessarily care about the consequences of their sexual conquest, but they don't have to care about it as much just because of biology. They just don't have the same liability. I think that sexual liberation wave of feminism is masculinizing women a little bit in like the sexual exchange. And also, I love that essay by Bridget. She's a really good follow on Twitter. She has a good podcast, too.
Yeah.
But... it's also to girls who want to read it and haven't read it yet. It's also like, don't feel shame. It's not a purity culture thing. You're not less than because you've had casual sex. You're not less than because you got exploited or used or sexually assaulted or anything like that. It's like, value yourself. You're worth more than that, girl. It's not like the shameful BS.
I love her so much.
Yeah, she's dope.
I really do. But yeah, I feel like these conversations should be able to happen more in feminist circles, and yet we're kind of routinely shut down and silenced, and told that we hate women, or, like, obviously we don't. You know what I mean?
I just, oh my God. I love women more
obviously
than
we
most
care
people do.
a lot, exactly. Obviously we care a lot. And modern feminism has also turned away a lot of men because it's gotten really into some, like,
There's
I
been
don't
some
know.
there's been some counter movements. There's been some counter movements. There's
Yeah.
been some weird ideologies sprout up. There's like MGTOW that or MGTOW, that's like men
Mhm.
going their own way. There's incels. There's
Yikes.
alpha males, the whole manosphere thing. And I guess Tate is kind of like the king of the manosphere,
The
but there's
alpha
different
males.
figures. There's this, I don't know if you saw, everyone was making fun of this, but there was like this flyer going around Twitter for like AlphaCon, and it was like all these dudes with like going like bald dudes with beards just going like, and their names were like Alpha whoever whatever.
Bald dudes with beards.
I mean, that's just what they look like.
Sorry, Paul.
that's just, that's just what they look like. But I'm just like, oh my god, like there's a counter movement, and I guess that's to be expected. That's certainly to be
Yeah.
expected. But and not all of them are wrong. I think I said this earlier, but
Mhm.
I tend to agree with men on a lot of criticisms of modern day feminism and a lot of things
Yeah.
that modern day feminism also doesn't touch on, which is like gender bias and like family and divorce court. A lot of men feel like they were, scammed by the system because they believe it
Yeah.
benefits women. And I think there are certain
Well,
systems that benefit women now.
it's true. It's
Yeah.
true, right? And this again is where we get into, are you using the government to give you
Right.
certain special privileges, where it's hurting other people?
Right.
And I do think divorce court and child custody cases is where a lot of the men going their own way, MGTOW, where they do have a lot of
They be
points.
making points. They be
And
making points.
Olivia, just for the audience, anyone who's watching to know, I do want to get more into this subject about how boys have it really hard nowadays,
Oh yeah.
because it's true. And I think it's important for people who have platforms to talk about it. But yeah, like, I mean, imagine that you are going into a child custody case, and anyone who knows people who have gone through this know how important it is to talk about. And the court is automatically just siding with the mother, even if she has this laundry list of issues and is not fit to take care of them. A lot of the times, like, men are ripped away from their children, aren't given as much time because the court favors women in a lot of these cases.
There have been some debate on the cause for that. And the answer really isn't chalked up to the judge hates men, because oftentimes the judge is a man that does that.
Yeah.
So it's a systemic thing, first of all. And I was doing some research on this last night actually, and there was the source is, I think, custody exchange. It's basically like a program to help parents who are in custody battles like figure out like a whole schedule and stuff. So it's like a resource. But the history behind that kind of involves feminism and views it in almost like a positive way, because it's like, okay, so the men that created these laws wanted women to stay in the home. They're the primary homemaker. A lot of times, the man who was, the single provider, they're working long hours. They're not doing a lot of the the child care, child rearing. They're not cooking, cleaning, homeschooling, taking the kids to and from school, like all the things that the woman would do. There are lasting effects from that. Now, a lot of the parental responsibilities are split more or less 50-50 in a lot of marriages, and a lot of men do not treat their wives like that. They don't say stay in the home. They don't say, you're the only one that takes care of the kids. But because of those lasting stereotypes and effects, a lot of judges are like, well, the mom's definitely the one that has taken care of the kids this whole time, so let's give them to the mom.
I mean, she's the nurturer, right?
Right. And so individualist feminists who were like, no, let's have equality under the law. I want to go to work. A father can stay home and raise the kids if they want. If they had listened to them earlier, maybe we wouldn't have those problems today.
And that sounds like a great place to end this conversation. If you want to follow us on our personal platforms, you can find me on Twitter at Liberty Anders. And Olivia?
I'm at Rondeau Olivia, and on Instagram, rondo.olivia.
And make sure to click like, please subscribe, and please leave a comment telling us your thoughts on the gender wars. What problems do you want us to talk about next week? And stay tuned for next Thursday. We'll be releasing another episode. We're going to do this every single week. And be sure to watch the shorts we're putting out every day.